You're in the classroom with Cath Vo. In the Classroom is a podcast where we talk about all things teaching and learning, education and research. Join me as I sit down with everyday educators and explore what's going on in the field and what this means for sustaining us as teachers in the classroom. If you want to be on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me at intheclassroom.com.au. Today's special guest is Julia Lippold. Julia is an EAL specialist teacher with over 18 years of teaching experience. In 2022, she was the recipient of the Educator's Most Influential Educators Award for spearheading the EAL program at Lauriston Girls School. She's recently co-authored a VCE English and EAL textbook published by Matilda Education, and she's passionate about supporting EAL learners across the middle years. We're so excited to have Julia on the show today and hope you take away practical insights for your own students. Alrighty, everybody, we're in the classroom with Julia Lippold. How are you, Julia?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so glad that it's finally come, the time where we finally get to get you on the podcast. So I always start the podcast with a story about how I met my guest. And I was searching my brain, trying to think about how we met. And the closest that I got to was thinking it would have to have been in the Vic TESOL Symposium. There was no other way that we could have crossed paths. So I think it was sometime in 2019. I think either we were in the same vicinity as each other or somebody was talking about you or something had stirred up in the air where Julia was being mentioned. And I remember actually connecting with you on LinkedIn a few days later. So, Julia, you are known for starting up Zealous English, or being this teacherpreneur kind of person. So tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into this space.
Wow, yes. I love the Vic TESOL Symposiums. They are awesome, but we'll come back to that later. I've been teaching EAL officially really for this is my 19th year of teaching and working in the EAL space. And it feels like yesterday that I walked into Blackburn English Language School as a first-year graduate teacher with my eyes and ears and heart open to working with, students of really interesting backgrounds and ended up, making the best connections and being mentored by some incredible EAL practitioners. I developed, personal connections with the people that I worked with, and it was like a family. I really enjoyed working in the new arrivals program. It's a special place, and anybody who has worked in new arrivals know that it touches you. And it was hard to leave. I was there for 8 years, and I had a sort of variety of different roles. Just started out as a teacher and then moved into some leadership positions. I worked in middle years curriculum. Then I did international student coordination, became a member of the executive, learned about leadership, and sort of was head of school for a while and worked with, some incredible people. But I realized that sort of got to that point after 8 years that, the premise of the new arrivals program is preparing students to work, enter into the mainstream. And I'd made a lot of connections, and I, was working in, that helping students on through that transition. But I decided that it was time to kind of, leave the nest and go out and go into the big wide world of mainstream. And took up a position at Lauriston Girls School as their EAL coordinator. And it was a big jump. The only thing that I sort of had that helped me in that transition was that I had an experience of being educated in a girls' school, in an independent girls' school. But I think your own personal high school experience is different from when you move into the teaching space. And the two schools that my high school is very different from Lauriston in terms of its culture. So, I was on my own. There was nobody else teaching EAL. It was just me. I had to work to develop the program. I had to advocate for the needs of the students. I sort of sat in it for a little while and tried to figure out how I would go about this, and collaborated with some colleagues, and we built the program up. We brought more people in. And yeah, really proud of the work that we were able to do. And then I sort of, yeah, started branching out and started my own consultancy. And I think that came from a point of I had so many teachers that had been in that position that I was in, only teacher teaching EAL, particularly graduate teachers teaching VCE EAL for the first time, sort of reaching out to me saying, help, help, help. And so I thought I would, yeah, start a bit of a blog slash vlog kind of resources. The middle years space seemed to be a bit lacking. And I'm a really passionate middle years EAL teacher. I love the VCE, I love the seniors, but I also really relish working with the middle years kids. And yeah, got to work with lots of schools and yeah, sort of spread my wings in that area. And yeah, I'm still at Lauriston, obviously. I also retrained as a mainstream English teacher as well. So I teach mainstream English. I do a bit of work in the wellbeing space. So I wear a couple of different hats. And yeah, I just really like getting out there and meeting people and yeah, supporting EAL practitioners as well.
But, Julia, that's fascinating. I mean, you've had such a diverse career as well and working in the EALD space, which you are incredibly passionate about. So I want to unpack that a bit more with you. What are some common misunderstandings when it comes to working with EALD students that you've experienced or that you've noticed that teachers might have or think about when they're working with EALD students? It can be misunderstandings or things that we might take for granted that we should really be thinking of.
I think the thing about EALD students is that they're emerging bilinguals and that sometimes we put them in a bit of a deficit model because English isn't their prompt, their first mode of language, so they haven't had that intimate sort of, native speaking exposure that we can sometimes, I guess, sell them a bit short, or that we don't think that they have the cognitive capacity of a mainstream, English student to complete tasks to the same sort of equitable level. And I often say that to, non-EAL teaching practitioners that, this student, just is missing the kind, like, I guess, the Lego pieces or the nuts and bolts to kind of, it's the vocabulary that's missing. It's not the cognition. Like, they're able to complete this task if you gave it to them in their first language. We need to scaffold up the language so that they complete that. I think that they can complete that task the same level. I think that's probably one of the biggest things. I think, bilinguals are really, able to, excel when they have the support.
In your classroom, we talk about ways of scaffolding language. What are some of the ways in which you have done that for your own students? What might that look like?
Oh, there's so many different ways you can do this, but EAL students really thrive on visual support. So I think the biggest thing that you can do to support an EAL learner is provide them with the visual kind of vocabulary that they need to complete whatever task they're doing. It's a huge load, whatever course a student is undertaking, that the vocabulary load is the biggest thing. And so visual glossaries are probably the first point of call, making it fun, and also bilingual glossaries, giving the student the opportunity to translate where possible. We know the importance of translanguaging and plurilingualism, and I guess fostering that as well in the space. So allowing students to take notes in first language to ease their cognitive load, have conversations where appropriate in first language as well. And I think, reinforcing that language as much as possible in different ways. Close activities, listening tasks. An example would be whenever I'm doing EAL support for students from mainstream English, I'll write a summary in simplified English, and then I'll do it as a listening task, and they've got to fill in the gaps and reinforce the language. So I did that, for example, with my year 10s. They're doing Macbeth in their mainstream English class, and I really wanted to reinforce some of the more sort of complex vocabulary that they need to be able to complete their analyses. And then they're doing multiple things at once. It's listening, speaking, reading, writing, and then they read it back out loud as well. So that's, I guess, a good example of one thing I might do.
I've noticed that you use a lot of plurilingual strategies in your classroom, and you've written, an amazing blog post about that. And I wanted to pick your brain about that a little bit more. So in terms of giving students opportunities to use their first language, you did mention now, visual glossaries, being able to like engage in translation and also translanguaging practices. What are some other ways that students might do that aside from, the visuals, or are there any other ways in which you've tried to experiment with that in your classroom?
Small group conversation is really important. Unpacking complex ideas verbally before written tasks. So an example of that might be summarize this passage to your partner in your first language. Um, and taking away that sort of need to write in second language immediately. That's where the students have the biggest hesitation. Kids don't like writing in general, but when it's not your first language, I think if you can, support the students to use the oral form first and then the written later, it can ease the cognitive load. So that's probably a good example of one I get students to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that. And I was also reading about your proofing and editing, groups. Can you tell our listeners a bit more about how you do that? Because I've actually never seen that work in a classroom for other teachers, using that particular strategy or bringing students together in different groups. So can you unpack that a bit more about what you do with your own students for proofing and editing?
Well, they have to be doing the work. That's the biggest message, and I guess I've stressed that to many people over the years, that if you're doing more correction than your students are doing, it's of no benefit to your students whatsoever. And particularly for an EAL learner, and this is what I see with students, particularly like pre-VCE, that if they're not able to identify their own mistakes in their writing, that they will continue to make the same mistakes. So we do a lot of error analysis. And then sort of working back from sort of step one is providing clues for the students to be able to identify their own mistakes. So using a correction code is the first thing. Allowing students to go back, proofread and edit their work before they can write the next. So a basic example of that is I do journal writing with my Year 7 EAL students every fortnight, and it's 45 minutes of writing time, no access to any external supports. And it'll be something very generic, but it'll be reinforcing like a language concept that we've learned or something that they're doing in their other subjects. But before they can start the new one, they've got to go back and go over the one that they do. Sometimes we swap books and we proofread and check each other's work. And then sort of moving up through the year levels, it will be, use the correction code. And then the students will have to then use that code to correct each other's work. And so it really gets the students to isolate in things like, subject-verb agreement, spelling, coherency, word order, tenses is a big one for EAL students. Switching tenses, punctuation, the basics of sort of like one sentence, one idea. They just love commas. They seem to be in their work. And then sort of really stripping it back to making it, I guess, a little bit more complex would be an error analysis task. So not using the correction code, but highlighting all of the mistakes. And then the students have to figure out themselves what those particular errors are. And it's obviously with support. I never send the students home or away without having that support there. So an example of that would be this week with my Year 10s, I got them to write for 10 minutes on a very generic question on Macbeth so that they could show their understanding of the plot and characters. They had to write, it wasn't about how much they could write in 10 minutes. It wasn't a speed writing activity. It was about accuracy. And so we did that. I then highlighted all of the errors, and they were surprised to see actually that when they really focused on accuracy, that they made fewer errors. And I said, well, this is where we need to continue moving on. And we'll do more of those now as well.
With your correction codes, where did you formulate that with your own students, or do you have resources that you've been pulling from to create your own, or how are they formed?
Yeah, I can't actually take any credit for the correction code. It was a former colleague of mine from Blackburn English Language School who developed one that we used across the whole school. So I've been using that same code since I was at Blackburn for a very long time. So Alex Perry, you're an absolute star. All credit to Alex and the work that she did in putting that together. And I've been using that for the duration of my career. I will isolate particular things with students, and they, for example, like they have a photocopied copy stuck in the back of their writing books. So it's quite explicit. They see it. And then my students know that from year 7 all the way to year 12 that we're using that same code. So that will they get to know it pretty quickly.
That's amazing. And I wanted to ask you about this because I remember when I did my TESOL degree, I was actually shocked by how little language knowledge I actually knew because I was the generation that went through schooling where it was all functional and all about, writing the text, but explicit grammar was never a thing. And so I never learnt language explicitly. So going through TESOL and finding myself in a position where I really struggled to understand, modals and, how they work within a text. And I had to actually relearn a lot of that. So for language knowledge, what was your experience with language? Had you always had that kind of understanding of language? Or did you have to really build on that knowledge as, through TESOL and through other professional learning? Or what was that like for you?
So my other teaching method is LOT, German. And I studied German in high school. And I come from a sort of semi-bilingual background. My father was from Austria, and I had a lot of motivation to learn German so that I could communicate with my family in Austria. And so I was pretty dedicated. And I didn't start officially learning German until I was in year 8, but I already had a fairly solid basic sort of conversational German or Austrian dialect. And I had the most incredible German teacher when I was in high school. And she was just an absolute gun at teaching grammar. And she taught it quite explicitly to us. So I guess my foundation in explicit grammar and parts of speech and knowledge of tenses and parts of speech stems from the work, like I guess my own schooling experience in high school. And I was so, I guess, moved by her. And when I did my very first teaching placement, I went back to my high school and was under her, I guess, observation and support. And she was really instrumental in my developing understanding of English grammar, but also other grammar. And then in my degree, in my what did I do? My arts languages degree at Monash, which is now I think called Arts Global. I had to do linguistics, and I found that transition, I guess, kind of easy. It's kind of just always come a little bit naturally to me. And one of the subjects I did there was syntax, and that was looking at syntax across languages. And so when you have that transfer of syntax and understanding how one language system works, you can kind of adapt that to how other language system works. And I can recommend a couple of resources in the space, but I think that when you unpack sort of the foundations of the English language structure, you can then apply that to others, and it can inform your teaching of students from other languages when you can isolate some of the idiosyncrasies of those languages and those syntax forms. I just loved it. I guess I'm one of those real grammar nerds. And just really fascinated about languages. I also studied French at university as well. So I did a double major in French and German, and the plan was to teach German. There was a bit of a shortage of German teachers, but the opportunity for EAL came up. And it was funny, you mentioned that when you were in your course at university and doing TESOL, we had to do an activity. I'll never forget this. We had to take an article from the newspaper, and we had to identify every part of speech and every grammatical structure that was in that. Not the whole article, but for example, a couple of paragraphs. And I remember I did it quite quickly, and my teacher said to me, "How did you do that?" And I said, "Oh, well, I kind of been doing this for a long time." Particularly when you look at, for example, German and the sentence structures and the tenses, and you have to isolate, all of the cases and just get used to it. And I guess I see things, how some people see maths in colors. I guess I see kind of grammar in colors.
Wow. that is what drives us as teachers when we're teaching language and teaching our EALD students. It's about how can language be a resource in the classroom. So that brings me to my next question. I know that you're so passionate about the middle year space and middle year's curriculum. And obviously, you're writing and designing curriculum at the moment. Is that correct?
I have been, but I'm not at the moment. I'm doing some consulting, but not in the curriculum space. I collaborated on a VCE textbook. Um, and previously, I had done a lot of work in the middle years curriculum space with VCAA, sort of on the previous iterations of the F to 10 curriculum. So when we were working with the sort of those S levels and those kinds of things, and the EAL developmental continuum. I was doing quite a bit of consultancy in that space, but life gets busy and I haven't done as much as recently. But the new F to 10 curriculum for EAL is in the pipeline. There's people working on that at the moment.
That's so exciting. So, walk me through that. Like when you're doing these different projects, what are the top considerations at the front of your mind? Like what are you thinking about when you're on all these different projects? You're thinking about your students. What are some of the things that you are thinking to yourself? Yeah, I really need to be thinking about this. Or
I think we're thinking about what is, I guess, like the bare bones, or like what are the things that these students need to be successful in their academic pursuit of language. And so we know that it can take 7 to 10 years for someone to obtain English language, academic proficiency in English. And so you have to, I guess, look at the layers of progress from a first phase to a second phase to a later phase learner. And so we have to unpack, and this is where I guess my grammar knowledge comes in, and you sort of look at, okay, well, what are the elements of a first, of grammar that and English language structure that a first phase English language learner is functioning at, and then how do we then build upon that? So it's looking at, okay, we're not going to go and teach the passive before we can teach, the simple tense and the sort of the isolating, those things across, and it's multifaceted too, because we're not just looking at the written form of English, we're looking at the spoken form and then the oral. It's a lot. It's very multi-layered. But I guess my involvement in that was looking at from the practical teaching sort of classroom, side of things. And then, I was doing a lot of work with new arrivals then obviously as well. So predominantly those first and second phase learners. But it's really interesting also to collaborate with the researchers too. So it's kind of working alongside those that are working in academic research space, along with the classroom practitioners. And I guess that melting pot of people coming together and collaborating on these quite complex documents that go through many iterations. And one of the things that I was personally involved in was actually looking at work samples of students writing, and annotating those work samples for the varying phases of the sort of the developmental continuum. And that was a very rewarding experience. And I remember telling one of my students, your work's going to be published in a document that, that many people are going to be looking at to help their teaching of other students. And I remember that student being quite proud of what she did. And she was a refugee. So, yeah.
wow. Oh, that's so powerful. And so for teachers that are working in mainstream schools, they're often alone. You yourself, this quite well. You yourself were in one. And so for teachers in those kinds of spaces, where do we go for knowledge or for, understanding how EALD works? What are some resources or some areas that you could recommend?
So in terms of just I don't want to say regular, it sounds derogatory, but a non-EAL teacher practitioner who hasn't had the formal TESOL or EAL training, who potentially has an EAL learner in their classroom, and I know there are probably tens of thousands of people out there in that situation. I would hope that you would have on staff an EAL practitioner that you could go to for support. But if you don't, every, I guess, I hope state in Australia has an EAL body in terms of in the Department of Education. So, for example, in Victoria, we have the EAL branch of the Department of Education, and they have curriculum liaison officers. I'm not sure if that's the exact term, but they are an absolute font and wealth of knowledge. And I've worked with people in that space before who have consulted and gone into schools, primary schools in particular, who've got, EAL students, but they don't have an EAL practitioner on staff, to work with those teachers to, yes, assess, for example, look at where the gaps are, because potentially the only information that that school might receive might be the transition report from the English language school if they've been to English language school. And if they don't, if they come in cold, if they, and the grade 3 teacher or the grade 4 teacher's got this kid that's just arrived and hasn't gone to language school and needs the support, I think the first port of call would be your liaison officer at the department. And then perhaps making links with VicTESOL or the those other branches around Australia. So every state in Australia has an EAL body. And I know that because I used to be on the board of ACTA, which is the Australian Council of TESOL Associations. So I think that you need to link in with those people and they will find someone for you because they have an incredible wealth of connections of people in both the primary and the secondary space. And then, there's a lot of really good work from an Australian researcher called Pauline Gibbons, and she's got some fabulous resources on supporting EAL students in the mainstream. And if you were going to go out and buy one resource to support EAL students in the mainstream, that really would be it, because I think that she's got incredible strategies, and not just for your regular sort of reading, writing, listening and speaking. She also focuses on the sciences as well, and so those more technical language dense subjects as well that could be of great benefit. I hope that answers your question.
Was there any others that you'd recommend in terms of grammar or anything else that you can think of?
Grammar's a tricky one. There's a really good one called Learner English by Michael Swan. It's a little bit dated now, but there are chapters on, I guess, key languages, Chinese, Russian, German, French, etc., that isolate those language anomalies between, English and that language. So it gives you a foundation in terms of, why is the Chinese, student not putting plural S's on their nouns? Oh, that's because they don't do that. Or, why are they not, using he and her, she, feminine, masculine pronouns? Oh, because they don't necessarily do that. And it gives you an indication of, like, I've always come back to that when I have a student, sort of a bit of an outlier. I had a Russian student a few years ago, and I had to go back and have a good look and a read through, and she was a year 12 VCE student who had a lot of gaps, and I was doing one-to-one support with her, but I've always found that resource to be quite helpful as well.
And that wraps up our conversation with Julia Lippold. A huge thank you to Julia for sharing her valuable insights and experiences with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe, rate me 5 stars and leave a review. Don't forget to share this episode with anyone who might find it inspiring. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll dive into more fascinating topics and discussions. Until then, keep learning, stay curious, and take care. Thanks for listening to In the Classroom.